The fate of strategy games in the last couple years has kinda sucked. City Skylines 2 barely runs, Fire Emblem Engage was super mid, and the next major RTS came out and failed, which was completely unexpected. But 2024 looks like a turning point. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming up that's worth talking about. So let's jump into my top 10-ish upcoming strategy games. The list order is fairly random, with the exception of the final title, which is the one that I am the most excited about. Let's begin. First up is Frostpunk 2. With the original busting onto the scene in 2018, the Frostpunk series is an alternate history, post-apocalyptic, late 1800s world where an enormous ice storm engulfed the planet. The original game was a survival city builder, focused on creating and maintaining a society against the elements. In Frostpunk 2, you've succeeded. The small town has been built into an immense metropolis, and it may be too big. The game looks to expand the city's management aspects of the series while adding a large secondary focus. Other factions vying for power. They say they want to maintain the identity of being a city builder, but they're adding some pretty deep level politics into the game. The original Frostpunk was incredibly atmospheric, and that seems to be the case for Frostpunk 2 as well. They built a really cool world, and expanding on it for the sequel looks great. And the choice to make a city builder where the city has already been built is incredibly fascinating. Though it does mean you probably should play Frostpunk 1 before going into the sequel. I'm really looking forward to what comes from this. I've always felt like the late game in most of this genre is a bit lacking. You eventually hit a point where there just aren't many decisions to be made and the game sort of tapers off. 11-bit studios deciding to take what would normally be the end game and instead having it be the starting point is a very fascinating direction that has a lot of potential. Hopefully it manages to maintain the feeling of a bleak and desperate fight for survival against the elements while they expand this more late game and faction-centric direction. Most of the games in this list are either sequels that continue what their predecessors did or new titles that are looking to fill a specific niche. Meanwhile, Stormgate is aiming to be everything everywhere all at once. A cinematic single-player experience with deep co-op, competitive ladder, esports, and a fully fledged editor with custom lobby system for user-generated content and a focus on 3 versus 3. They're a little bit ambitious. The setting is a mid-apocalyptic Earth where a series of Stormgates have opened, leading to a big demon invasion that sci-fi humans are fighting off. There's also an unannounced third faction that, according to Reddit, is probably anime waifus. The competitive RTS community seems pretty enthralled with Frost Giant's ideas for the game, and their Kickstarter has raised a casual $1.8 million so far, in addition to their sizable investments from other sources. Stormgate is by far the largest scale project here, and they have the resources to make something pretty amazing, but they also want to do literally everything, and that sounds really hard. We do know that they've invested an absurd amount into building the game in Unreal 5, as well as their own proprietary Snowplay engine, which does give me hope. The only way to have this much breadth is to have rock-solid fundamentals. I don't think that Stormgate will officially launch this year, but the alpha is already playable for many people, and as time goes on, the breadth of their invites gets larger and larger. You can sign up for Stormgate on their website. They also have a subreddit where you can tell them what type of anime waifu you think would be best for fighting off a demon invasion. Horde defense games are really popular. I sort of see games like They Are Billions as the next step up from the tower defense genre, where instead of just building towers and defenses, you need to construct the industry and bases capable of funding that defense. Cataclysmo looks like it takes that idea yet another step further, asking why use a pre-built selection of towers and walls to defend when you can design your own. The game has a demo on Steam for the first couple of levels, so my thoughts are going to be largely based off of that. And I think the game is really cool. The first thing I noticed is that Cataclysmo, even in the tutorial, tells you to build stuff but never holds your hand. It'll say stuff like, get a mill, put it near the trees, and make sure there's a path to your base. Do the same for the stone, build some houses, make some walls, and don't die. But leaves the experimentation, the placement, and the optimization up to you. I love that. The game is a horde defense with a focus on creative building, and that creativity involves letting the player make stupid decisions and do things their own way from the get-go. And speaking of stupid, I was testing to see how badly the game would actually let me play by building the worst possible defenses I could, and yeah, it allows you to be so inventive and creative that I lost on the tutorial. And I like that. I don't think Cataclysmo is going to be able to hit the massive scale of attacks like They Are Billions, but I'm excited to play around with the silly construction ideas, maybe eventually find some unique strategies that are all my own, and then finally I can beat the tutorial. When the remake of Age of Mythology was announced, I got really excited. I got so excited that I'm not even going to give an overview of the game here, because you can just watch this quick 3-hour, 33-minute, 33-second retrospective to fill yourself in before we continue the video. Don't worry, I'll wait. After the game was announced, we've learned not a whole lot, but there are a few things. Age of Mythology Retold is going to be a remake, not a remaster, so the entire game is being rebuilt from the ground up instead of being a fancy paint job, and it's being done in the Bang engine, which is the same engine the game was initially made in. I guess the goal is to maintain exactly the same feeling, but it does feel a bit odd to remake a game in its own ancient engine when a ton of significantly more modern and easier to use alternatives exist. Even I can learn how to use Unreal to make super basic RTS stuff in a few hours. The remaster is being done by World's Edge Studio, who did the Age of Empires 2 and 3 definitive editions. I never played Age of Empires 3, but the definitive edition for 2 is pretty universally regarded as fantastic, and that gives me a lot of hope. It took about 2 years from the announcement of Age 2 Definitive before it released, and if we assume a similar timeline for Age of Mythology Retold, then we're all idiots because game development is a nightmare of unforeseen pitfalls. But we are coming upon 2 years since the announcement trailer, so there is a chance that we get to later this year. There are a few games in development that are pretty directly inspired by Command & Conquer, and Tempest Rising is definitely the highest profile one. Set in a post-World War III world where an electric plant called Tempest has started rapidly spreading across the Earth, 3 factions vie for dominance over the ruined planet. Well, they claim it's 3 factions. As of right now, we only know about the Global Defense Force and the Tempest Dynasty. Both of these factions will have their own 11 mission-long campaigns. From what we've seen of the factions, they're all unique, and some of their showcase designs are really interesting, like this Tempest Sphere, which is a giant rolly ball of doom that goes around crushing stuff. I love weird unit designs like this, and if we get more of it, I'm gonna be really happy. Aesthetically, Tempest Rising looks good, particularly once the larger units start coming out. The glowing red Tempest vines scattered around the map look fantastic and give the world an eerie and unique feeling to it. Tempest Rising already had a small demo where we were able to play a mission from the GDF and the Dynasty. The core gameplay felt solid, the units we saw had a nice variety of abilities, and overall the control felt decent. But things needed polish, and to the team's credit, they took the feedback and agreed. They delayed the game's release to work on the issues, which is something I wish I didn't have to praise, but in the modern world of releasing half-baked garbage and claiming it'll get fixed later, this is fantastic to see. I'm really hoping Tempest Rises scratches that Command & Conquer itch that a lot of us have been feeling since EA destroyed the franchise and turned it into a mobile game. For most of the games on this list, I have a pretty decent idea of what we're going to get out of them, but Outpost Infinity Siege is absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. Outpost is a blend of first-person shooter, base builder, and tower defense, where you build an epic fortress and then grab your weapon and fight alongside the defenses. The idea is awesome, and the game looks like it's going all in on making the scale absurd. Specific details in English are a bit lacking, the devs are not native English speakers, but it looks like Outpost is going to be mostly a single-player focused game with an online co-op mode. The vibe seems to be traveling from planet to planet, deploying your big defensive thing, and then holding off hordes of enemies. The game excites me because there aren't a ton of strategy games that use the first-person perspective. It gives me Battlezone vibes. Battlezone was an old-school RTS and shooter and tank piloting mashup thing from the late 90s. It was a really cool game that was ahead of its time. It was one of the secret treasures to be rented out from Blockbuster, and if Outpost Infinity Siege is anything like that, then it's gonna be a good time. I think Outpost is probably the most ambitious game on the list. Mixing FPS and tower defense while getting it to work in a way that feels good to play requires a development team with a deep understanding of both genres. But it looks like the type of game that if it works is going to make a lot of unique and memorable experiences. Dustfront looks absolutely wild. Not like the mechanics are crazy, but look at it! Worms, I think? The game describes itself as a mix of Command & Conquer with a campaign of global conquest from games like Dawn of War, Dark Crusade, or the Total War series. Dustfront is single-player only with a major focus on this campaign. The game's being made by a solo developer with the name of RTS Demon. He's been working on the project for almost 8 years and has finally announced it a few months ago. And that's about what we know. I don't really know what to make of Dustfront, but I can say that the art style is already iconic. I wish I could say more, but honestly, I respect a solo developer's desire to not spend a bunch of time on media and instead just make the game. So we'll let him cook. The next game is a bit hard for me to talk about simply because I'm just not qualified to do it compared to others. The Homeworld series has been around for a long time now. It is beloved for its large-scale space battles, and I never really got into it. It was one of those games that I always knew that I would like and then just never played. You know how it is, we've all been there. Fortunately, Homeworld 3 looks like a really good jumping on point. The game looks sweet. The scope and scale of Homeworld 3 looks insane. In addition to the big starship battles using all 3 axes of space, the maps are covered in these huge megastructures that actually come into play as physical objects, making a space game that actually has what's effectively terrain, instead of being mostly an empty void. Homeworld 3 looks like it's gonna be one of the biggest budget strategy games coming out this year, and if the gameplay matches what we've seen in the teasers, then we're in for a treat. Before we talk about the game that I'm most excited about, I have a couple of special mentions. Games that I had a hard time fitting into the actual rules, but I want to talk about anyway. First up is Sins of a Solar Empire 2. Sins 1 was a very popular intro-level 4X game, lacking the menus within menus of other Empire Builder games like Europa Universalis, and trading it in for a bit faster-paced gameplay. Sins uses a sci-fi setting to tread the line between RTS and 4X gameplay. The sequel, Sins of a Solar Empire 2, has been in alpha and beta access for a while now, as an Epic Game Store exclusive. What they want you to do is pay for access to the alpha and beta, and then you're kind of locked in to the Epic Game Store launcher when the game releases. Epic is paying them to remain exclusive for a while. The money is being used to develop the game, and once the contract expires, it'll be available as a full product on Steam. The thing is, at a glance, Sins of a Solar Empire 2 doesn't look like a huge departure from the original. It kind of looks like a remake. The game follows the same general flow of building a fleet, moving around a solar system, fighting pirates, conquering and colonizing planets, and eventually finding the opponents and beating them up. At this point in development, the factions feel pretty identical to their predecessors, and that's not great. Sins of a Solar Empire doesn't have any sort of story mode to differentiate, and it seems like most of the value in the game is coming from small changes. A fancy new engine, some cleaner UI, and a system where instead of being static entities, the colonizable planets now orbit around their host star. At first, I was honestly a bit unimpressed with this direction, but as I started mulling it over more, the potential of some absolutely wild plays seems pretty interesting with the orbital mechanic. Sins of a Solar Empire was already a very solid game to begin with, and maybe this level of spice will make it worth it, but only time will tell. My second special mention actually goes to a game that came out last year, but it's really good and nobody's talking about it, so I'm gonna break the rules a bit so I can. Last Train Home is incredible. The game follows a group of Czechoslovakian legionnaires, initially fighting alongside their Russian allies in the First World War. But now they find themselves caught in the fray as the Empire collapses into civil war. Unable to find their way home through the West, the legionaries must instead make the agonizing trip east across the entirety of Russia to reach Vladivostok where they can find a ship home. Taking inspiration from the very real revolt of the Czechoslovak Legion, Last Train Home feels like a cross between the American classic Oregon Trail and XCOM. There's a constant scramble to get as many resources as possible, upgrade your train, and care for your soldiers. Making your way home takes time, fuel, and food. And as you progress, you find yourself facing off against the increasingly powerful Red Army as they gain an advantage over the Whites in the Civil War and become more coordinated, all while preparing to tackle the nightmare hellscape that is Siberia. The game isn't perfect, a lot of the management feels a little bit clunky, and the cover system can be frustrating to deal with, but Last Train Home absolutely nails the miserable, desperate vibe of a band of outcasts stuck in a foreign nation that is collapsing around them. I'm gonna have to make a full video on this game because I can't do it justice here. But if you want to grow attached to a group of legionaries only to watch them freeze to death in Siberia because you got greedy and decided to buy a gun instead of more fuel, then Last Train Home is the game for you. It is time for the game that I am most excited about. Welcome to Dwarf. While Tempest Rising may be a spiritual successor to Command & Conquer, Dwarf is Red Alert's spirit animal. Everything is big, everything is absurd, everything is creative. Seriously, look at this, and look at this, and this, Everything in this game is ridiculous to the 10th power. The hardest part of this video is figuring out what absurd things to flash on the screen because every single shot in this game's trailers continue to pile more and more insanity. And the most crazy part is that this is an indie game being made by 2 people. Obviously, being an indie game means development is going to be slow, but it also unshackles them. From what I've gathered, Dwarf isn't trying to make a balanced multiplayer experience. They don't have a publisher trying to force them to build the next great esport. Instead, they're going back to the roots of RTS, the ridiculous, over-the-top rule of cool above everything else, and I, for one, am glad to see it. Oh, and on top of that, they're making the resource system be one where you have to extract, refine, and then deliver refined parts directly to production structures. So not only is this Red Alert 2 on steroids, but throw in some Factorio, because these devs get it. I know I'm supposed to do the, oh well guys, you gotta temper your expectations, it's just a development team of 2 people, they might not be able to realize all of their, I don't care, okay? Listen, the game looks awesome, this game looks like it was made specifically for me and I am so excited. You're not supposed to do conclusions on YouTube anymore because it ruins your watch time, so we're done. Watch the Age Mythology video again. Bye.